Hi, everybody. Thanks for being with me. We have a very important story to cover here today. It has to do with Chevron and Stephen Donziger, but it has to do with something much more than that as well. It has to do with the environmental crisis that we are all facing and the behavior of the fossil fuel companies. We know what needs to happen. We know that we're all facing this existential crisis. We know that we have, 10 to 12 years in order to make this radical change, or we could be doing such irreparable harm to this planet that our children, our great grandchildren, would have a very difficult time habiting this planet. We know how important this is. And we know that the fossil fuel companies know it as well. So you would be thinking that they would be leading the charge to make this just transition from a dirty economy to a clean economy. They're not only not leading the charge, they are resisting the charge. They are resisting the change. And what this story has to do with is the lengths to which they will go, even to the point of criminal prosecution of a U.S. citizen who just happens to be a human rights activist, an environmental lawyer who led a team that caught Chevron doing something deeply illegal, deeply harmful, and what they are now doing and trying to do to Stephen Donziger as a consequence. Listen up. This is important because never forget, what they can do to anybody, they can do to you. Stephen Donziger, thank you for being with me.
Thanks for having me.
So, Stephen, this story goes all the way back. It begins in 1964. And I want to take everyone through the chronology here, the timeline, so that everybody can really get a sense of what this story is about. What happened in the 1960s down in Ecuador?
Well, thank you for having me. In the 1960s, Texaco, then a very big American oil company, now owned by Chevron, but back then independent, signed a contract with Ecuador's government to drill over a very large area of the Amazon rainforest, 1,500 square miles. And over the next 25 years, they built hundreds of wells, and they adopted a policy to deliberately dump the oil waste into streams and rivers that indigenous peoples and other rural communities relied on for their drinking water, their bathing, and their fishing. And over year after year, this kept happening, and over time, there was a massive epidemic of cancer. People were dying. There's virtually no medical care. Texaco is using almost no environmental control methods, and the entire area became poisoned with industrial toxins that kill. And the net result is by the early 1990s, by the time Texaco left, hundreds, if not thousands, of people had died. And to this day, since there's been no cleanup, because now Chevron, which owns Texaco, continues to mock the law and not comply with the law, many more have died. So it's really a humanitarian crisis. When you look at it, you see lakes of oil on the ground of the rainforest. It's an apocalyptic nightmare. You hear stories from indigenous peoples about how they were lied to by Texaco engineers when they complained about the oil. They were told it was like milk and contained vitamins, and you could drink it. And this was a mass industrial poisoning done deliberately out of greed by Texaco, now Chevron. And we've been fighting for years to hold them accountable in courts of law. We have had success, and they've come after me as a result.
Okay. I know that there were environmental standards such as they were and such as they are here in the United States. In Ecuador, they were even more lax, and even those were violated. Explain to us what they did. What is this? I've heard that I heard you say, or I read that in order to save $3 on each pit, they kept them unlined. What exactly did they do that caused the poisoning of the Amazon in that area?
Sure. So they did a lot of things that were substandard operationally, but there were three main problems with how they drilled. Problem number one is when you drill a well, all these drilling muds come up that have toxic natural heavy metals and man-made chemicals that cause cancer, and you're supposed to dispose of them properly. And in Ecuador, they just built pits out of the jungle floor, unlined pits, dumped the stuff in there, ran pipes out of the sides of the pits to rivers and streams, and they just took this cancer-causing oil waste into the drinking water supply of the whole rainforest. So that was wrong. And then the second thing is they would take what's called water or production, which is this cancer-causing wastewater that comes out of the ground with the oil, and it needs to be separated. The oil goes to market, the wastewater needs to be re-injected back into the well cavity. Texaco just ran it off into rivers and streams, and it contained benzene and other cancer-causing substances. And the third thing is they flared the natural gas. They created this black rain phenomenon by polluting the air rather than disposing of or utilizing the natural gas properly. And that meant that when it rained, I mean, think about this, all the water sources are already contaminated. So people were trying to get clean water from the rain. It rains a lot in the forest. And even the rain became contaminated because of this black soot that was in the air, and they called it black rain. I mean, it would rain black, basically. So, all of the people in this region, none of whom have money as we know it, by the way, although they lived very prosperously in the forest, off of the forest, before it became contaminated by Texaco. So all of these people are surrounded multiple times a day in the air they breathe, and the food they eat, and the water they drink, and the water in which they bathe, where they catch their fish, the animals they catch in the forest. They're surrounded multiple times a day by cancer-causing substances that over time kill. And that's exactly what's happened.
Okay. In the 1970s, Chevron bought Texaco.
Chevron
Were they
bought-
continuing?
I'm sorry, Marianne.
Were they
Chevron
continuing?
bought
Okay. And were they continuing to drill?
Yeah, so they drilled right up until the early 1990s, and they left as Texaco in 1992, and then Chevron bought Texaco in 2001 and inherited the liability, inherited the lawsuit.
Okay. When did they stop the drilling?
They stopped the drilling in the early 1990s, and they left in 1992, but they never cleaned any of this mess.
Okay. Now, what was your situation here in the United States that you heard about this? What impelled you to go down there and check this out?
Yeah, so in the early 90s, I had just graduated from law school. A classmate of mine from law school his father was a lawyer who had been born in Ecuador, was living in the United States. And he organized a delegation of lawyers and scientists and public health specialists. There were about 10 of us who went down to investigate what we had heard was a massive environmental crime. We spent 8 or 9 days in this part of Ecuador in the jungle, documenting the problems, taking water samples, and the net result is we filed a lawsuit against Texaco, because remember, Chevron had yet to buy Texaco, in 1993 in New York. And the reason we filed in New York was because Texaco's headquarters were in New York, and that's where the crime occurred. That is where Texaco executives decided that they would play God to the people of Ecuador, and to save $3 a barrel, dump billions of gallons of toxic waste onto indigenous ancestral lands, resulting in the deaths of many people. So they were sued in New York originally in 1993 as part of a class action lawsuit. To make a long story short, Texaco fought for 10 years to move the case back down to Ecuador's courts. They obviously wanted it there because they had, drilled and dumped with impunity for 25 years. They never thought a court would have the capability in that country to hold them accountable, so they wanted it down there. That battle took 10 years. That was really the first phase of the case. Many people died during those 10 years. We were fighting hard to get into U.S. courts, to get before a jury. Texaco won that battle and had the case moved to Ecuador, where the case was refiled. The same case was refiled down in Ecuador's courts in 2001 with an Ecuadorian legal team.
Now, by that time, Chevron is the company because they have bought Texaco. And I read somewhere or heard you say that Chevron at that point said, if the trial is moved to Ecuador, we will abide by whatever the judgment is or the settlement is of the Ecuadorian Supreme Court. Is that correct?
That's correct. As a condition of moving the case from U.S. courts to Ecuador, Chevron was forced to accept jurisdiction before Ecuador's courts.
Okay.
So as a result, any decision that might come out of Ecuador's courts against them, they would have to comply with under this condition that U.S. courts imposed on them to transfer the case down to Ecuador. So they did accept jurisdiction, and we had an 8-year trial. They litigated it fully, and we ended up winning the trial with voluminous scientific evidence against them. I mean, there were literally tens of thousands of chemical sampling results that showed massive levels of life-threatening contaminants at their hundreds of former well sites. And in 2011, we won a historic judgment. I should say the communities of Ecuador won with the help of their lawyers. I was one of them, in the amount of $18 billion, later reduced, cut in half by the Ecuador Supreme Court for various reasons. So the final judgment, the judgment was affirmed by Ecuador Supreme Court, was $9.5 billion. They've still yet to pay a penny. That judgment, by the way, was affirmed in 2013 when it became final. And again, they've been fighting ever since, mostly by trying to attack me.
Okay. Now, by 2012, 2013, the Supreme Court of Ecuador has said to Chevron, you owe $9.5 billion. Chevron had already said, whatever they come down with, we will pay. They were very surprised because obviously they were playing footsies under the table in the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s is almost an understatement. But things have changed. The consciousness of the world about colonial behavior, et cetera, and probably the consciousness of people down in Ecuador about how they were being treated by these companies. So you won $9.5 billion. What is the controversy about other countries either affirming and acknowledging that judgment or not? Is there some question about some countries saying, along with Chevron, that they do not accept that judgment? Does the United States officially accept that judgment? What's the story there?
Well, that question really goes to the nub of the matter, which is Chevron agreed to jurisdiction in Ecuador's courts, lost the case, and then refused to abide by Ecuador's courts where they agreed to accept jurisdiction. Total bad faith. The indigenous peoples litigate for years and years and years. By then it was 18 years. They finally win. And Chevron thumbs its nose at the people, and their chief lawyer says, we're never going to pay you. As a matter of fact, we're going to threaten you with a lifetime of litigation unless you just drop the case. And to me, that's environmental racism. That would never happen had the judgment been in U.S. courts, for example, in my opinion. As a result of that, the Ecuadorian people who own the judgment had to hire lawyers in other countries to enforce their judgment against Chevron's assets in other places because Chevron had stripped all of its assets from Ecuador and there was nothing to collect there. So that led to a multi-year kind of litigation process in various countries around the world, mostly centered in Canada, where the Ecuadorians ended up winning a number of court victories in an effort to forcibly seize Chevron's assets, to force the company to, to comply with the rule of law, comply with the Ecuador judgment, and fulfill the promises it had made originally to U.S. courts to accept jurisdiction in Ecuador. And that's the process that we've been engaged in now for a number of years. And parallel to that, because they felt so much risk from this process, and I believe they knew they were in the wrong, they started to sue me personally back here in New York in the very same courts where they wouldn't agree to litigate the original trial back in the early 1990s.
Okay, so let's slow down a little bit here. Why did Stephen Donziger become the focus of their ire?
Well, in my opinion, it's just a classic corporate defense playbook. I mean, they don't want people thinking about the fact that courts found they dumped billions of gallons of cancer-causing toxic waste out of pure greed in the rainforest. They'd rather have people thinking about something else. They need a foil. So they created one out of me, in my opinion. So they sued me as a way to get people to shift their attention from what the crimes, the environmental crimes that Chevron committed in Ecuador, to the behavior of the lawyer or one of the lawyers that helped to hold them accountable. So to me, it's a classic misdirection strategy. You see it all the time in politics or when a scandal hits.
I understand.
Like blame the other person. That's what they tried to do to me.
What is their claim regarding your malfeasance? What do they say you did that you were such a terrible guy?
They claimed I bribed the judge in Ecuador. It's false. Their evidence is a man to whom they've paid millions of dollars, an Ecuadorian man who claims he was in a meeting with me where I approved the bribe of a trial judge. And there's just zero evidence this happened other than the words out of the mouth of this paid Chevron witness. Unfortunately, Chevron was able to, steer their fraud case, their retaliation case against me in New York courts to a judge, Lewis Kaplan, who's a former tobacco industry defense lawyer, and he credited the false testimony of this witness. He denied me a jury. He imposed all these restrictions on evidence. For example, he wouldn't let us put in any evidence about the environmental contamination in Ecuador. He tried to just deny the reality of what the case was about and let Chevron put up false witness testimony from a man to whom they had paid $2 million and coached for 53 days before he took the stand and lied about me. He later admitted lying in a separate arbitration proceeding about a year after the end of this racketeering case they charged me with. They also sued me, by the way, for the most money anyone's ever been sued for in the history of the United States, $60 billion. Now, think about that. I worked for years and years and years. I've never had a single grievance complaint from any of my clients. I'm a man of high ethics, at least I believe I am. Others have vouched for my ethics. And Judge Kaplan credited a paid witness who admitted lying, his story over mine. It's really an outrage, but that was the beginning of this, what I would call this Kafkaesque process in U.S. courts, where Judge Kaplan, without a jury, along with Chevron's lawyers, have been attacking me incessantly as a way, again, to distract attention from the fact the company faces a $10 billion liability for committing environmental crimes in Ecuador's Amazon.
Okay. How is that case separate from the case that you're actually dealing with right now in terms of the court order and your computer? Are these two separate cases, two separate issues?
They're the same. They're the same. One, the issue with the court order and my computer, which I'll explain right now, is an outgrowth of this fraud case based on false evidence where Judge Kaplan, without a jury, found that I committed fraud in Ecuador. By the way, I'll add before I get to this detail that, Ecuador's appellate courts and Canada's Supreme Court, 28 appellate judges in total, 6 courts, have validated the Ecuadorian judgment on the merits or for enforcement purposes. Judge Kaplan's the only judge who ruled that it was obtained fraudulently, and again, it was based on this paid witness from Chevron. So I want to make that clear. Judge Kaplan's view of me is a rogue, very minority view compared to 28 other judges. Now, after Judge Kaplan ruled this way, the Ecuadorians, with my help, went into Canada and won a series of court victories in an effort to force Chevron to comply with the judgment and pay the money out of its Canadian assets. Simultaneous to that, to try to stop me from working on that case, the Chevron lawyers went back to Judge Kaplan and got him to issue an order for me to turn over my computer and cell phone to Chevron on the theory that I, a human rights lawyer working out of my little apartment in Manhattan, owed them millions and millions of dollars for their legal fees, which money I do not have. But they had a theory that I was hiding money. They needed to see my computer, but in my computer is our entire case file, all our confidential information, privileged information. And I told Judge Kaplan that I couldn't do that. I had to appeal that order. It was clearly unlawful. We had never seen an order like that in U.S. history. Attorney discussions that are confidential with your clients or with other attorneys about strategy. I mean, the most sacrosanct information that is totally protected under various rules of privilege in the law in any rule of law country, not just the United States. They were trying to get that from me by seizing my computer and cell phone. And that was a bridge too far. I mean, I'm a man of the rule of law. Let me be clear. I've complied with hundreds of court orders that were hostile to me from Judge Kaplan. I mean, literally hundreds. At this point, I was like, if you do that, my clients, I will be violating privileges held by my clients in Ecuador. It will put their lives
in danger, people.
In danger. And, to boot, I appealed it. So while I was appealing the lawfulness of this bizarre order, Judge Kaplan charged me with criminal contempt of court for not complying with the order I was appealing. I mean, think about that. I was seeking judicial review of his order, which clearly was unlawful, and by the way, was found to be at least partially unlawful on my appeal. And while I was appealing his order, he charged me with criminal contempt of court and had me locked up, in my view, as a retaliation measure. And in my view, again, it was a total abuse of power by Judge Kaplan. But here I am now, if you can believe it, 779 days later, I am still in detention in my home, where I sit right now, with an ankle bracelet shackled to my lower left leg that I wear 24/7. I sleep with it, I eat with it, I bathe with it. And it tracks every movement of mine, even around my own apartment. I will add that this is a misdemeanor case, Marianne, meaning it's considered a very petty offense. And the longest sentence ever imposed on a lawyer in New York who's been convicted of my offense is 90 days of home confinement, and I've already served 8 times that amount. Clearly, this is retaliation imposed by Judge Kaplan, another judge, Loretta Preska, to punish me for my success as a human rights lawyer, and I think to send a message of intimidation to other lawyers and activists to not do this work, which is critically important frontline work to hold polluters accountable and to help save the planet.
Now, what happened that courts in New York decided not even to go after this because it didn't seem important enough to them? And so Judge Kaplan was able to find a loophole in the law and then basically said to Chevron, you can use the courts to do it if you want. Most Americans wouldn't think this was even possible in this country. Explain that.
That's a very important point. I mean, look, what I've just described, I think, is disturbing on a number of levels. But I'm going to tell you something that's even more disturbing, which is when Judge Kaplan charged me with criminal contempt, he was required to take it to the federal prosecutor in New York to prosecute me. That's the SDNY, a very famous, well-respected office here in New York. He took it to them. They looked at the charges. They said, you know what, we're not wasting our resources on this case. At that point, he should have dropped it. But instead, he appointed a private corporate law firm named Seward and Kissel to prosecute me directly out of taxpayer funds without disclosing that Seward and Kissel had Chevron as a client. I'm basically being prosecuted by Chevron directly in the name of the public, and it was Chevron that asked the judge to lock me up. A judge, by the way, who Judge Kaplan also appointed when cases are supposed to be assigned randomly by local rule. He appointed the judge, who's a member of the Federalist Society, a close friend of his, and they have worked together with this private Chevron prosecutor to punish me and to use the procedures of the law to punish me. I'm the only person in American history charged with a federal misdemeanor with no prior criminal record who's ever been locked up prior to trial for even a day. And I was locked up over 700 days prior to my so-called trial. I say that because Judge Preska, who Kaplan appointed, also denied me a jury, even though I'm facing jail, and convicted me, unsurprisingly, wouldn't let me testify in my defense in a way that, denied me a jury, wouldn't let me really put forth my main defense, and convicted me. And she's now going to sentence me in a few days. And I face, on top of my 2 years and 2 months plus of house arrest, again, where the longest sentence ever was only 90 days, I now face an additional 6 months in prison.
If she decides to do that.
If she decides to put me there, we're hoping she won't. And, obviously I'm appealing all this, but in the meantime, these trial judges, Judge Kaplan and Preska, I believe they have an enormous amount of power, and it's very, very difficult to hold them accountable.
On what basis were you disbarred?
Purely 100% on Judge Kaplan's false findings based on the lying Chevron witness. They disbarred me. Did not even give me a hearing where I could challenge Judge Kaplan's evidence. That's another extraordinary feature of this attack on me. I was disbarred without a hearing. By the way, I have not been disbarred in the District of Columbia, where I also hold a law license. But, again, completely unfair.
Has the environmental community come to your defense in the way you need them to or would want them to?
Many groups have stepped up big time. Amnesty International, Rainforest Action Network, Amazon Watch, Global Witness, 68 Nobel laureates, 37 bar associations, hundreds and hundreds of lawyers around the world. I've gotten a huge amount of support from lawyers and people of influence all over the place. However, I will say this, in New York where I live, I've almost gotten zero support from the legal community. I wish they would step up. I mean, there are so many things that are happening to me that I believe threaten the rule of law and threaten advocacy by all lawyers. So I wish I could get more support, but I'm really happy with the support I've gotten. And, we're growing this movement. I will say this goes so far beyond me. I mean, this isn't just about Stephen Donziger. This is about the rule of law in the United States of America. We can't live in a country where human rights lawyers get locked up by corporations. That's what's happened.
That's really what this is about. I want everybody to make sure that you heard that. Chevron is able to basically override the normal procedures of a U.S. court of law and use a U.S. court of law in order to prosecute a U.S. citizen that dares to challenge its authority. That's really what this is about.
It's the first corporate prosecution in U.S. history. Is that
first corporate prosecution in U.S.
and
history?
This, I want to be very clear. I went to Harvard Law School. I grew up with a lot of opportunity. There are a lot of serious problems in our criminal justice system besides Stephen Donziger. Obviously, racism, police racism, and the like, over-incarceration, all sorts of problems. What's happening to me, though, is a first-of-its-kind situation that we've never had before in the United States, a private corporation take over the machinery of the public prosecutorial function and go after their main critic. That is unbelievable. It's what you'd expect to see, say, in Saudi Arabia or Russia or China, okay? In the United States, and I will say this to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Merrick Garland, the leaders of our country, you really can't be good on the climate issue and let human rights lawyers be locked up in your own country. And we've asked Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, to intervene and take back this private corporate prosecution and have the DOJ take over the case. And again, I'll remind people the DOJ refused to prosecute me. So by taking over the case, they will probably dismiss it and let me be released. But it's an outrage that a private corporation is prosecuting anybody in America. And it's happening to me.
So let me go back a little bit. When we talked a few months ago, the request from the public was that we ask Merrick Garland to do what you just said, to take this back from Chevron, return it to the Department of Justice, and let justice take its course. Now, you got some very high-level supporters, including congressmen and senators, who did publicly request that Merrick Garland and the DOJ intervene here. They were ignored. What happened then?
Merrick Garland failed to act. I think, again, it's not reflective of, a person who's really on top of his job. No disrespect, but it's like, how, if you're Attorney General, do you let corporations prosecute individuals? The fact is Merrick Garland totally blew off 6 congresspersons, including Jamie Raskin, who headed the second impeachment trial against Donald Trump, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, Rashida Tlaib. I mean, some major progressive leaders of our country were completely blown off by Merrick Garland.
What is the loophole in the law that even allowed Judge Kaplan to do this?
So there is a rule that in extraordinarily rare circumstances, a judge in a contempt case can appoint a private prosecutor, but it's only employed when, for some conflict of interest reason, the normal federal prosecutor can't take the case. But that's not what happened here. The normal federal prosecutor could take the case, but declined to prosecute me because I believe he found the charges were baseless. So you can use this rule on rare occasions. What Judge Kaplan did is he abused the rule and used it when he should not have and appointed a private prosecutor. Now, I will say this. On the handful of situations when a private prosecutor has been appointed, judges take extra pains to appoint a neutral prosecutor, not someone with a financial interest or some sort of interest in the outcome.
The crowd, the Federalist Society, Chevron, yeah. It's the gang, it's the cabal there.
The gang. And Judge Kaplan appointed a Chevron lawyer. That was a complete abuse of the rule. And I will say this, if you really take a step back, I'm being prosecuted by a Chevron lawyer. Judge Kaplan has investments in Chevron according to his financial disclosure forms. And Judge Preska, who he appointed to oversee this case, the judge who actually locked me up, she's a leader of something called the Federalist Society, to which Chevron is a major donor, to which Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, which is Chevron's main law firm attacking me, is a major donor. And I will say that the main witnesses against me in this charade of a trial with no jury that was just held in May were Chevron lawyers from the Gibson, Dunn law firm. So I was being prosecuted by a Chevron lawyer. My judge had financial ties to Chevron. And my main witnesses were all Chevron lawyers. And Chevron financed much of this prosecution because they were paying their own lawyers to help the Chevron prosecutor that Judge Kaplan appointed get the information together to present against me. I mean, it's a damn outrage. I was prosecuted by Chevron. Chevron financed the case. Chevron is getting a criminal conviction against their main critic, in my opinion, through illegal, unconstitutional means. I believe we're going to win the appeal, by the way. But the damage they can do to me in the meantime by locking me up for 2+ years is extraordinary. And we just don't seem to be able to stop it.
It's a show trial, really.
It is. It is a show trial. And it was a show trial. I couldn't even take the stand to explain the ethical and legal reasons that I had to appeal Judge Kaplan's order that I turn over my computer. She wouldn't even let me explain my defense, Judge Preska.
And
I mean,
Chevron...
it was just, it's a sad commentary, by the way, on the U.S. judicial system. And, you know, Marianne, there's a larger implication. I mean, you ran for president. You think about foreign policy. I mean, how in the heck can Joe Biden comment on human rights violations in other countries when this kind of thing happens in his own country and he does nothing about it? I mean, the hypocrisy is extraordinary. And, you know, in our country, in our government, again, I call on the Biden administration, on Merrick Garland, to pay attention to this, review this case. You know, these judges have abused their power. And in any event, there should never be a Chevron prosecution of anyone, a corporate prosecution of anyone in this country. It's wrong on every level. It violates the rule of law. No country that adheres to the rule of law would ever do this kind of prosecution.
Okay, so let's go back a little bit. Chevron, by now, for much less money than it has spent trying to prosecute you, could have already cleaned up that area of the Amazon and made right many of the thousands of people down in Ecuador whose lives have been so harmed by this and whose ancestors have been so harmed. Is that accurate to say?
Yes, and I'll point out that Chevron has used no fewer than 60 law firms and 2,000 lawyers to attack me and the Ecuadorian communities who won the judgment against them.
So
They
is it...
spent $2 or $3 billion on legal fees. Can you imagine what could have been done to improve the lives of the indigenous?
So is it fair to say... Right. So is it fair to say that the way they're saying it, if they pay that $9.5 billion to the Ecuadorian government, that they are opening the way for environmental lawyers, environmental activists all over the world to come after them? Is that what this is really about? Their effort to freeze this movement, to make sure that everybody looks at what they did to Stephen Donziger and reconsiders their action?
It is, in my opinion, yes. I mean, they want to use the attacks on me to scare the heck out of anyone who would do this kind of work, to hold any big company in the fossil fuel industry accountable for global warming, for pollution, for fraud, or for any of the bad acts they commit all over the world. Because frankly, I've learned in my 28 years working on this case that, at least in Chevron's case, but I also believe Exxon, BP, and the other big companies, part of their business model is to privatize profits, socialize costs, meaning take the oil they can sell out of the ground,
That's right.
dump the waste into the forest or wherever they're drilling, and leave the cleanup bill to the most vulnerable communities on the planet, in this case, indigenous groups. That's their business model. So when they get sued by these indigenous groups, they experience that as some sort of unfair thing. They're like, wait a second, that's not how it works. You know, we're taking the oil out of the ground. We don't have to clean up. That's not part of our deal. You know, and unfortunately, Ecuador's government never enforced Ecuador's own laws against them when they were doing all this toxic dumping, which essentially leaves it in the hands of plaintiffs' lawyers like myself and others to hold them accountable for the incredible amount of harm they've caused, and they continue to cause. I want to emphasize, just because they left Ecuador in 1992 doesn't mean it's over. The harm they left is still hurting people today.
I think that there's such a rise in consciousness. The world sees these things much different. People understand the corporate colonialism involved there. People understand the trampling of the rights of indigenous peoples, and people also understand very particularly the trampling of the rights of Latin American indigenous people at the hands of North American governments and North American companies. So you were right in the middle of this zeitgeist, and it's so important that we help people understand the very human story going on here. You will be sentenced, and I don't know why I put it in quotes, except it's just that it's such a show trial sentence, on October 1st. Now, the judge could say you can go based on time served, as hideous 779 days. She could say more of that, or she could send you to prison. How long could she send you to prison for?
For a maximum
What would be the
6
maximum
months.
sentence she could give you?
6 months.
6 months.
I mean, no one for my level of offense in the federal system with no criminal record like me goes to prison. I mean, nobody's gone to prison for this kind of thing ever. So, I'm hoping she will, kind of reach for her better angels, even though there's been a lot of, I think abuse of power up to this point, and let me go home, take off my ankle bracelet, and resume my normal life with my family. By the way, I have a 15-year-old son, a wife. I mean, we can't even go out to dinner. We can't leave spontaneously to go play ball in the park. We haven't been able to get on a plane, or I haven't been able to get on a plane for 3 years. I just spent my 3rd straight birthday in home detention. I just spent my 60th birthday, in home detention.
How can we help you, Stephen?
Well, the best way to help is to go to our website, freedonziger.com. And if you can help us with our legal defense fund, please donate. If you can't, please sign up for our campaign. We have thousands of people who've signed up. We're trying to build a movement of support for me and the Ecuadorian people, and to hold Chevron accountable, and also to build a base to deal with these issues in the fossil fuel industry that harm so many people around the world. So again, if you want to help, please go to freedonziger.com, the website. It's one word, Donziger. There's instructions there on how to help. You can read about the case. You can read articles about the case. And finally, if you live in the New York area, please come to court on the 1st of October at 8:30 in the morning. It's the federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan. Information's on the website. We're going to have a big rally at 8:30 in the morning, and everybody's going to go into court and bear witness to what Judge Prescott does to me. So again, on October 1st in New York, try to come to court in support of us, and go to the website freedonziger.com.
I was there for the first day of the trial. I don't think I'm going to be able to be there on October 1st, but I hope all of you who are in New York will go down there. It's quite extraordinary to be among like-minded people who are taking a stand for justice on this in this kind of a way. To actually go into the courtroom, this is a big deal. This is not Perry Mason. This is real life. So Stephen Donziger, my very, very best to you. And to all of you who are watching and who are listening, I hope you will take this case to heart. If you care about the environmentalist movement, if you care about climate change, if you care about the need of the people, we the people, to take a stand now regarding the activities of the fossil fuel companies, this is it. This is ground zero, because this is an effort on the part of Chevron to freeze all challenge to its behavior. And as I said earlier, what they do to anybody, they can do to you. Thank you so much.